Welcome to Founding Chronicles. If you enjoy powerful stories from America's past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our next journey into history. Now, let's step back to the year 1886 and uncover the haunting tale of a boy whose mind was unlike any other. The year was 1886. America was moving fast into a new age of railroads, steel, and invention. But in small towns and quiet farm villages, life still beat slowly, tied to the seasons and to the hard lessons of nature. It was in one such place, tucked between the long fields of Pennsylvania, that a boy was born whose mind would not follow the path of other children. While others played marbles in the dirt and chased each other in the meadows, he stared at the ground where fallen birds lay, or watched with unblinking eyes when a funeral passed by. His name was Samuel Whitaker. He was only 12 years old when whispers that he was too curious about things that ought to be left alone. Samuel's family was not wealthy. His father was a stern carpenter, his hands thick with calluses, his back bent from years of lifting timber. His mother was gentle, worn by many births and losses, her eyes always holding both kindness and sorrow. They had buried 2 children before Samuel had learned to walk. In 1886, death was never far from the home. Illness, fever, accidents, and childbirth all could claim a life in a single night. Perhaps it was no wonder that the boy grew fascinated with what others only feared. From the time he was small, Samuel asked questions that made adults shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Why does a body grow cold so quickly? He once asked his schoolteacher, after a classmate's father had died. What happens inside when the breath is gone, but the face still looks like him? A teacher, a man of the old ways, told him sternly that such matters were for God alone, not for a child to probe. But Samuel was not satisfied. He began to write questions in a small notebook he carried everywhere, questions that no one in his town had the patience or the stomach to answer. That notebook soon filled with careful drawings of lungs, hearts, and bones. He had never seen such things himself, but he copied diagrams from a tattered medical pamphlet he found discarded behind the apothecary's shop. To Samuel, these sketches were treasures, secrets that revealed how fragile and mysterious life truly was. He did not draw flowers or houses, as other boys did. He drew skulls, ribs, and the shapes of hands once living. His curiosity frightened some of the townsfolk, who whispered that the boy might be touched with madness. Yet others, especially the old and weary who had buried loved ones, looked at him with a strange respect. For Samuel asked the questions they had once asked in their own grief, but had long buried in silence. One cold morning in February, tragedy struck again. A neighbor's child, barely younger than Samuel, died suddenly of scarlet fever. The town gathered for the funeral, the air heavy with grief. As the coffin was lowered into the earth, Samuel stood apart, watching not with tears, but with a sharp, focused stillness. Afterward, when others went home to their suppers, Samuel lingered near the churchyard, staring at the freshly turned soil. That evening, he wrote in his notebook, "I want to know what makes the body stop. What is death made of? Is it air or blood or something we cannot see?" His mother found the note and wept. His father scolded him harshly, saying no good could come of such morbid thoughts. But Samuel's spirit could not be turned. He began to study by candlelight, long after his parents had gone to bed, reading whatever scraps of medical writing he could find. He read about bloodletting, about fever and consumption, about the strange experiments of European doctors who tried to measure the exact moment life slipped away. These words filled him with both awe and terror, but also with a sense of duty. To him, death was not just an end, it was a mystery, a doorway. And if God had given him a mind eager to question, Was it not his duty to seek answers, even in the darkest places? One night, as a summer storm beat against the shutters, Samuel sat at his desk with the candle burning low. He had drawn a human heart as carefully as his young hand could manage, each chamber and vein marked in detail. Beneath it he wrote, "The body is a machine. When it stops, something is broken. If I can learn what breaks, maybe I can learn what keeps it whole." That was the first time the boy's curiosity crossed into something more and almost sacred. Mission. But in a small town of 1886, such ideas were dangerous. Neighbors began to talk. Some said the boy had too much pride, trying to know what only God should know. Others said he had the look of someone marked for greatness, perhaps even destined to become a healer. The whispers grew louder when Samuel was caught sneaking near the undertaker's shed, peering at the place where coffins were kept. He insisted he only wanted to see how the body was prepared, but the undertaker chased him away with curses. And yet, not all doors were closed to him. The town doctor, an older man with kind eyes, noticed Samuel's interest. One afternoon, he invited the boy into his office. There, surrounded by jars of herbs and instruments of healing, Samuel's heart raced with wonder. The doctor showed him how to listen to a heartbeat with a stethoscope, how to feel the pulse in the wrist, how to tell when life was strong and when it was fading. For Samuel, it was like touching the border between life and death with his own hands. That night, he wrote in his notebook, "To know life, one must know death. To fear death is to fear truth itself." The more Samuel learned, the more isolated he became from other children. They laughed at him, calling him grave boy or little undertaker. He bore the insults silently, retreating into his world of questions and sketches. But beneath that silence was a fire of determination that someday, somehow, he would uncover the truth that others turned away from. For Samuel, death was not a thing to be feared, but a puzzle to be solved. And in the year 1886, when most children dreamed of games, Samuel Whitaker began a journey that would shake not only his town, but the very way people thought about life and death. The summer of 1886 rolled on, heavy with heat and the scent of cut hay. Samuel spent much of his time indoors, bent over his little desk in the corner of his room, the air thick with candle smoke and the faint smell of ink, while other boys fished in the creek or played ball in the dusty fields. Samuel's world grew smaller and deeper, like a tunnel leading into the unknown. His parents worried, though in different ways. His father muttered that no good man was raised by staring at shadows and bones, while his mother prayed quietly that her son's strange hunger for knowledge might someday serve God's will rather. Ben tempt darkness. In truth, death was all around him, not only in the cemetery's rows of leaning stones, but in the rhythm of daily life. In 1886 America, cholera and scarlet fever still haunted towns like his. Accidents with farm tools or wagons could end a life in an instant. Families prepared for death as they prepared for the harvest, keeping black garments ready in the chest, and speaking of heaven with a kind of practical certainty. Samuel absorbed these customs with sharp attention. He watched how mourners moved slowly behind the coffin, how the preacher's voice cracked when speaking of a soul's journey, how the women laid black veils over their faces like a curtain. Between life and eternity, he did not mock these ways, nor did he resist them. He studied them, as though each ritual held a clue to the larger riddle he sought to solve. One August night, a storm swept through the town, tearing shingles from roofs and flooding the low fields. Samuel's father was called out to help repair a collapsed barn. Hours later, he returned with news that a worker had been killed when a beam fell. Samuel listened, not with horror, but with sharp and painful curiosity. He slipped away to the barn the next day, when the smell of damp hay still clung to the air. There, he asked the men what had happened, how quickly the man had died, whether he had spoken in his final moments. Some of the older men, hardened by years of labor, answered gruffly. But one, an old farmer with watery eyes, looked at Samuel and said, "Boy, the hardest part of death is not knowing what lingers when breath is gone. The face is still the same, but the man is nowhere to be found." Those words burned into Samuel's heart. He returned home and wrote in his notebook, "The mystery is not in the body, but in the vanishing. What leaves? Where does it go? If I can follow it, I can know the truth of both life and death." That autumn, his fascination deepened. The town doctor, sensing both promise and danger in the boy's restless mind, gave him an old anatomy book, its pages yellowed, its images of skeletons and organs inked in stark black. Samuel treated the book as sacred. He carried it with him, reading in secret corners, running his fingers over the diagrams as though they were maps to another world. Slowly, he began to understand what the body was made of: muscles, tissues, fluids, but this knowledge only sharpened his hunger. If the body was a machine, then why did it stop? Was there a hidden key, something unseen, that doctors had overlooked? As winter approached, a new trial tested Samuel's heart. His grandmother, a woman who had once rocked him to sleep with lullabies, fell ill with pneumonia. Day by day, Samuel watched her body weaken, her breath rattling in her chest. He sat by her bedside, listening, counting each gasp, scribbling notes in the margins of his book when no one noticed. His mother wept softly in the next room, but Samuel remained steady, as though every labored breath was a lesson to be recorded. When the old woman finally passed, Samuel was the one who closed her eyes. He whispered, almost reverently, "I will find where you have gone." It was at her funeral that whispers about the boy grew louder. Some townsfolk muttered that he was cold-hearted, that no child should watch death with such clear eyes. Others said he had been given a rare gift, that perhaps God had placed him on earth to lift the veil from the great mystery. Samuel ignored both praise and scorn. For him, it was not about pride or reputation. It was about truth. But truth has a cost. His father, weary of gossip and ashamed of the boy's growing obsession, grew harsher in his discipline. He forbade Samuel from reading those cursed books and threatened to burn the notebook. Samuel, desperate, began to hide his writings beneath loose floorboards, scratching notes in the dark when he could not sleep. His world became one of secrets and silence, his hunger for answers clashing against the stern will of the man who had raised him. Still, fate placed before him another turning point. In December, a traveling lecturer came through town, bringing with him strange instruments and bold ideas. He spoke at the church hall about electricity, about how the spark of life might be measured or even captured. Samuel sat at the edge of his chair, his pulse racing. The lecturer claimed that some scientists believed the human soul weighed something, that it might be possible to detect the very instant it departed the body. The crowd gasped, half in awe, half in horror, but Samuel's heart leapt. That night, under the pale glow of the lantern, he wrote furiously, "If the soul is real, then it is not beyond study. If it leaves the body, it must leave signs. I must learn to see them." As snow blanketed the little town, Samuel's path became clear in his own mind. He would not turn away, no matter the cost. He would study death as carefully as others studied crops or stars. He would bear the weight of fear, of ridicule, of loneliness, because deep in his soul he believed that hidden within death was not despair, but understanding. And perhaps, just perhaps, the key to preserving life itself. Spring returned to Pennsylvania in 1887, and with it the smell of thawed earth and the call of meadowlarks in the fields. For most in town, it was a season of hope, of planting and renewal. But for Samuel, now 13, it was the season when his private search deepened into something far more dangerous. He had grown taller that year, his voice carrying the first shadows of manhood, but his eyes still held the same piercing curiosity that unsettled others. By now, his notebook had swelled to dozens of pages filled with sketches, questions, and fragments of observations. He no longer wrote like a boy, but like a young scholar, weighing ideas with care. He had begun to see patterns, linking illness to breath, strength to blood, death to silence. Yet the more he thought he understood, the more he felt the great curtain before him, and the stronger his desire to push it aside. One quiet evening, Samuel slipped into the doctor's office while the man was away on a call. He did not steal, but he studied. On the shelves were glass jars containing preserved specimens, an infant's hand, a coiled snake, a bird's wing suspended in fluid. Samuel stared at them with a mixture of awe and dread. He touched the cold glass and whispered, "You are still here, though your life is gone. What keeps you here? What keeps us all?" He copied notes from a medical manual into his book, his hand trembling not from fear, but from the thrill of discovery. When the doctor returned and found him there, Samuel expected punishment. Instead, the old man sighed heavily and said, "You will not stop, will you, boy?" Samuel shook his head. The doctor placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then pray your heart stays soft, for knowledge without mercy can be a terrible thing." But Samuel's heart, though heavy with questions, still held compassion. He was not cold, as some accused. He felt deeply for the people around him. When a neighbor's wife died giving birth, Samuel helped carry wood for the grieving family's fire. When cholera struck the town, he walked from house to house, bringing water, listening to the cries of the sick, and studying carefully how fever rose and fell. He never turned away from suffering. He faced it directly, his gaze steady, even when grown men flinched. And in those moments, when he stood beside the dying, he felt closest to the truth he sought. Yet his obsession placed a gulf between him and other children. While boys his age whispered about games or girls or dreams of traveling the country, Samuel's thoughts circled the same dark sun. He carried his notebook to school, hiding it beneath his desk, sketching bones when he should have been copying sums. One afternoon, a classmate snatched the book from him and read aloud the words Samuel had written. "The soul may weigh no more than a breath, yet it moves mountains of flesh. Where it departs, the body is only clay." The room filled with laughter, but not the warm laughter of children. It was sharp, mocking, cruel. Samuel took the book back silently, his face pale, his hands shaking. That night, he wrote only one line: "To walk this road is to walk alone." Aloneness did not stop him. If anything, it made him more determined. He began to experiment in secret, using small animals that he found dead in the fields, birds fallen from trees, a rabbit struck by a wagon wheel. He studied them, not with cruelty, but with reverence. He watched how stiffness set in, how the eyes grew dull, how the body seemed to empty of something unseen. He kept careful records, noting the time, the changes, the sense. These observations, crude as they were, gave him a sense of progress. He was learning, step by step, what others refused to even look at. But danger soon followed. One evening, his father discovered the hidden pages beneath the floorboards. Furious, he held the notebook above the fire, threatening to burn it. Samuel cried out, his voice breaking, begging for mercy. For a long moment, the flames licked at the edge of the paper. Then his father dropped the book to the floor and struck the boy across the face. "Enough," he roared. "You'll end up damned with this devil's work." Samuel, clutching the notebook to his chest, tasted blood in his mouth, and said, "Nothing." He knew then that his journey would no longer be protected within his home. He would have to walk more carefully, guarding his secrets even more tightly. As spring turned into summer, a traveling show passed through town, bringing with it strange exhibits from across the country. One of them was a demonstration of electricity. The showman, a sharp-eyed man in a black coat, claimed that electricity could wake the dead. He attached wires to the leg of a frog and made it twitch. The crowd gasped and murmured. Samuel stood frozen, his heart hammering. He saw in that twitch not a parlor trick, but a sign that perhaps death itself could be measured, tested, even challenged. He wrote later that night, "If a spark can move a limb, then perhaps the line between death and life is thinner than we think. Perhaps it is not final, but a veil that can be lifted." From that day forward, Samuel no longer thought only of studying death. He began to dream, quietly, dangerously, of defying it. By the autumn of 1887, Samuel Whitaker was no longer a child in the eyes of the town. He had stretched taller, his shoulders beginning to carry the shape of a young man. Yet the same burning intensity lived behind his eyes. Some whispered he would become a doctor, others that he would fall into ruin. Whatever they believed, no one doubted that he was set apart. The boy who once asked quiet questions now carried himself with a grave seriousness, as though every hour of his life bore the weight of some secret task. He had grown more cautious. With his studies, careful not to let his father discover the pages he still filled by candlelight. But his mind had leapt beyond sketches and notes. He now wondered if he could test his ideas in ways greater than watching the slow changes in fallen birds or rabbits. He dreamed of experiments that would brush the very edge of life itself. Opportunity came in a way both tragic and fateful. That winter, a miner's accident brought 3 bodies to the town men crushed when the earth gave way. Samuel, slipping quietly into the edge of the gathering, watched as the lifeless forms were laid upon boards. Neighbors turned away, crossing themselves, whispering prayers. Samuel alone stepped closer, his eyes fixed not on horror but on mystery. He saw how quickly color fled, how stillness set in, and he wondered if the soul had left in a rush, like air from a burst bellows, or if it lingered, waiting. That night, his notebook bore words that chilled even himself. To find the line between living and gone, one must watch not just the dead, but the dying. His compassion, however, never abandoned him. When influenza swept through the region, Samuel walked from door to door, carrying buckets of water, blankets, and food. He sat at bedsides where others dared not stay, listening to the faint breaths of the sick, holding the hands of those slipping away. He did not turn from the dying. He leaned closer, watching, listening, almost willing to cross the threshold with them. To grieving families, it seemed strange a boy so calm in the presence of death, but for some, his steady presence was a comfort. Old women whispered that perhaps he carried a gift, the kind given by Providence to rare souls. But in Samuel's mind, his gift was not mystical. It was simply the courage to face what others fled. He saw no good in shielding himself from reality. If truth lived in the final breath, then he would stand at its edge as long as it took. The greatest test of his young life came suddenly. His own father fell ill one bitter January evening. The strong carpenter who once lifted beams with ease now lay sweating and gasping, his breath rattling in his chest. Samuel's mother wept beside the bed, but Samuel sat silently, watching, measuring, recording in his mind. Every rise and fall of his father's chest seemed a lesson. He knew love and grief were swelling inside him, but another part of him, the part that had been sharpened by years of study, told him to watch carefully, to learn. His father saw the boy's eyes and whispered, with what strength he had left, "Don't turn me into one of your questions, Samuel." The boy's lips trembled, but he said softly, "I only want to keep you." The illness passed not into death, but into slow recovery. His father survived, though weakened, and afterward he avoided his son's gaze. Samuel's mother, however, seemed to understand. She placed her hand on the boy's head one night and said quietly, "Your heart is not cold, Samuel. It hurts more than you show. Just don't let your hunger for answers take away your mercy." Those words remained with him always. By the spring of 1888, Samuel's reputation had grown beyond the town. The doctor, impressed and troubled by the boy's relentless pursuit, wrote to a colleague in Philadelphia, telling him of a young mind that treated death as if it were a science. The letter spoke of a boy who drew anatomy with astonishing precision, who spoke of life and death in ways that unsettled even grown men. Months later, an invitation came. A physician from the city offered to meet Samuel to see for himself whether such tales were true. The day Samuel left town for Philadelphia, a small crowd gathered at the station. Some wished him well. Others stood back in silence, still fearful of the boy who had spent so much time among the dying. Samuel boarded the train with his notebook in hand, his heart pounding with both excitement and dread. For the first time, he would step beyond the narrow streets of his childhood and walk among men who had dedicated their lives to the very mysteries that had haunted him. In Philadelphia, he found not scorn, but curiosity. The physician showed him instruments Samuel had only read of: microscopes, scales, strange electrical devices. For hours, Samuel watched demonstrations, his eyes wide with wonder. He was told of experiments across the world, scientists in Europe weighing bodies at the moment of death, doctors testing electricity on corpses, philosophers writing about the soul as if it could be trapped in a jar. To Samuel, it was as though the private thoughts of his own notebook had leapt into reality. He was not alone in his quest. Others, too, sought to pierce the veil. But unlike many of those men, Samuel carried no pride, no hunger for glory. He returned home with his head full of knowledge, but his heart still tied to the simple graves of his town. He walked again among the leaning stones of the churchyard, tracing names carved into fading marble, and whispered, "I will not forget you. All I have learned is for your sake." And so, by the close of that year, Samuel Whitaker was no longer simply a boy with a notebook. He had become something more, a bridge between his small town and the great questions of the age. A young soul who faced death not with fear, but with reverence, with a kind of sacred curiosity. Though his life was only beginning, he had already carved a path few dared to tread. And in the silence of his room, by the flickering light of a candle, Samuel wrote the words that would mark the heart of his journey. "If death is the end, let me know it truly. If death is not the end, let me follow where it leads. For in knowing, I will not only understand death, I will understand life itself."